That's what I listen to when I'm flying.
Well, here we are again. And I say again because today's episode is a follow-up and an add-on to the last episode. And that's because, as the music tells you, Chad's back. And we're really building on what we talked about last time. And not just becoming a CFI, but more like transcending all that stuff you learn just to get the certificate. And then really digging deep into the backstory about what it takes to operate successfully and to pass this whole aviation thing along to someone else. And maybe even make a good living while you're at it. Don't go away.
Record.
You went to McKinney?
Went to McKinney today. Said hi to all of Pam's old co-workers.
That's such a bummer she can't work there anymore.
Yeah, that is a bummer. It's a good day to fly, though. Had some really nice cells out over some of the approach fixes, and it was just dropping rain, so it was cool. You could see under them and fly under them. So you got a little free plane wash while we were flying around.
Nice. What were you flying?
Cessna Columbia 400.
Cool.
It was really a Cessna 400.
All right, man. Well, it's been actually not that long since you were here, which is cool. And as promised, the show's back. So here we are with another episode with Chad. But one of the coolest things about this last episode that we did, not only is it the first one back in a while, but I've got a lot of feedback on it. I mean, I get feedback from time to time. We all do. But I mean, this was a loaded with feedback episode. We really sort of struck a chord with our discussion of when are you ready? When can you become a CFI? When should you be a CFI? And so on. And I got a few things about that. We're going to get into that in a minute. But Chad, you even got an email too, and you forwarded it on to me. I'm just going to read it for everyone, then you can kind of tell us about it. But somebody heard Chad on the show and said, I listened to the latest episode of Podcasting on a Plane. I heard you tell Brandon that you're going to be in OKC to work with someone in their TBM. I don't have any clue when you'll be here, how long you'll be there, but he has a plane at Wiley Post. And if you're going to be in town, let me know. And we'll figure out a time for breakfast or lunch, and I'll buy. Look forward to getting together soon. So, Chad, you're even getting emails off the last episode, aren't you?
Yep, got a nice email and emailed him back. So we've exchanged a couple of emails now, and not real sure when I'm going to be up there next, but I'm definitely looking forward to meeting Mr. Brian Jackson.
Cool. Well, Chad, I'm just going to say it for everyone to hear right now. You're going to record that meetup, aren't you?
Definitely.
Right on. Well, cool. So back, I guess, to the subject matter at hand. Like I said, we've had sort of a lot of thoughts on this, and the guy Daniel Switkin that sent in the feedback from last time that we ended up doing we made a whole episode out of it, even gave me one back as well. And then Rob sent me a fun one too. Rob Mark, formerly of Flying Magazine, but we won't get into that now. But it's going to be an audio feedback, and we're going to have a listen to that in a couple minutes and sort of get in with that as well. But Dan responded to me. He says, hey, Brandon, I just heard the episode, and thank you. The discussion of knowing when you're ready was probably the most helpful. I feel like that's such a subjective thing, not just for yourself, but for the CFI who signs you off for the practical, and the DPE too. And up here where he is, he says 6 to 8 hours of oral exam is pretty normal for a CFI check ride, which is obviously intimidating. And even after you pass, there's a question of feeling ready. And I was thinking of starting with flight reviews and wings phases because besides not requiring months of time commitment, at least I'm starting with people who already know how to fly, right? But on the other hand, though, rusty pilots might be just as dangerous as brand new pilots or even worse. So to be continued for sure. But the good thing is I did get my AGI last year, so I could start to build some hours of ground instruction. And I also enjoy talking through everything in the pre-flight and when I fly with friends, if they're interested, of course. And the more that I explain, teach, and share, the better I'll be at it when I eventually am giving dual given. Cheers, Daniel. So there's kind of a lot to unpack there, but we talked last time so much about how it's not like it's just, hey, you got your CFI, so here you go, good luck, bro. I mean, most people are going to start at a school or a club or somewhere where they can sort of let you dip one foot in at a time and have a little mentorship around you, right?
Absolutely. Most of the places where you'd start out, I think, have the insurance for you. If you're going to go teach owners in their airplanes, I think that's a whole separate issue.
Yeah, and actually, let's talk about that for a minute. I don't want to let that pass us by. What is your policy on carrying insurance? I mean, you fly obviously, well, you fly almost exclusively with people in their aircraft, but even for the person who flies outside of a school, for instance, where you're covered under their blanket policy, what do you like to do if you're basically a freelancer?
Any airplane I get into, I make sure I'm a named insured on the policy, regardless of who I'm flying with and when. If I'm not a named insured, I don't get in the airplane.
Okay. Does that ever cause any problems or anything?
No, it's never caused an issue, actually. And then the two groups that I teach for on their certificate, what we do is we make sure that the company name is a named insured with a letter of subrogation.
Okay. So if you're teaching for instance, you're working for Joe Casey or something, you're doing some Meridian stuff, you would be the named insured and then with a waiver of subrogation. That's what you're talking about?
That is correct.
Okay, cool. And yeah, I mean, I think at that point when you're going to someone that's actually a legitimate company for a recurrent, then I don't think anybody would have a problem with that at all. Okay, interesting. All right, and then what about for like in clubs and things like that? I know most clubs, as long as you're a member and so on, I don't know any club that'll let you teach in their planes if you're not a member, but schools and clubs tend to have their own insurance policies, which cover, a lot, but at the same time, they may have a very, very high deductible. And I'm not talking like 1,000 or 1,500. I'm talking the Seminole that I used to fly for a Part 141 flight school. Their deductible was $25,000 if you wad up that airplane. So that's the bill you're going to be left with, even if the insurance does cover it. So what do you think people should do as far as like renter's insurance and things like that? I mean, do you carry that typically, or do you just not do any of that to care?
I personally do not do any of that.
Okay. So it's just named insured or Joe's named insured and you're subrogated or whatever. Okay.
Yep. It's either, Joe's named insured or Casey's named insured and I'm subrogated, or I'm named insured, period.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Yeah, it's funny. I asked for this person I used to teach to fly. They had texted me. This was probably almost 10 years ago now. They bought an airplane as a group. Well, the guy and a few of his friends, I should say. And they're like, hey, we just want to have you be one of the CFIs that will sort of teach for our little partnership here. And I said, yeah, great, party on. So can you just go ahead and add me the insurance or whatever? And they almost acted like they were offended. Like, we have an open pilot clause, so you're fine. I said, well, okay. But I mean, frankly, I don't know any of you and I don't really want to be involved in this if I'm not insured on it. So whatever. And said, well, the other instructor doesn't seem to care. I said, well, I guess you're going to work with the other instructor then, man. And unfortunately, that was the last time we talked. But it was weird because I had never felt sort of, I don't want to say attacked, but it was a really awkward moment over something that I felt like would be very, very simple. But they seemed sort of offended that I'd asked to be a named insured on their policy. And I don't think that costs a whole lot extra. So
I'm going to tell you, it doesn't cost anything. No, number one, it's a zero. Number two, on aircraft insurance policies in general, the premium is generally based on the pilot with the lowest qualifications, and then you work your way up. Some policies do have a named insured limit. In other words, they will allow 3 named insureds or 2 named insureds and 2 flight instructors, or et cetera, et cetera. If you exceed the limit, you either have to drop someone off or pay a little extra. However, I've never ran into a situation where it wasn't completely free to have me added to an insurance policy.
Sure. And at that point, I mean, you're the one who's got to give all the times and fill out the paperwork and everything. I mean, every time I've been added, somebody's insurance just emails me a form that I fill out and scan and send back. It's really no problem. So, yeah, I guess I don't know if there's a moral to the story other than just, if somebody's weird about that, then they don't know what they're talking about, or you probably don't want anything to do with that operation. Well, anyway, back to the CFI stuff. I mean, and that's probably honestly a good segue, given that that's one of those problems that somebody who doesn't, for instance, go start off at a flight school may run into. And there's this whole bunch of flying that you've never really had to think about that much before. For instance, when people own their aircraft and you got to be on their insurance because you're used to just flying an airplane where you get the keys from the dispatch office and that's it, and somebody else takes care of the insurance. But I have some comments here from Rob. It's an audio feedback, so let's take a couple minutes and listen to what he has to say and sort of let that guide the rest of our discussion. What do you think?
I think that sounds great.
Hey, it's Rob in Chicago with Jetwine. A really great episode on flight instructors with Chad. It brought home something I learned at the most recent Oshkosh that you couldn't make it to. Anyway, the story is that I ran into one of my students that I had signed off for a certificate a long time ago. In fact, this guy Brian was my first student. So we had a chance to talk about what it was like then and how I was teaching, and considering the fact that I got my certificate and they went, go to it, don't hurt anybody. That was about all the advice I had. But the important point is that he mentioned that he knew I was a new instructor. And I said, well, of course I wasn't, that much older than you. And he said, no, I could tell from the way you were handling yourself that you were new. But I also knew that you understood way more about this than I did, and I was willing to go with it. Towards the end of the training, Brian seemed to be struggling. He just didn't have the confidence I needed him to display, that I could think, well, he'll be fine. He's going to do okay all on his own. He just didn't seem to be there. And I could not for the life of me figure out what the problem was. And so I had him fly with another instructor, a lady who was using my airplane, and she went out and flew with him for half an hour, 45 minutes, and came back and said, Rob, he flies fine. I think the problem, for what Brian tells me, is that you don't shut up. You don't let him make any decisions. You kind of reinforce what should be done before he actually makes the decision. So he just kind of sits there and takes your direction. And I sat there and thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it, of course. But the next time Brian and I flew, I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Ellen says you fly fine. I'm just going to sit here and have you run through the maneuvers, and I'm not going to say anything to you unless you ask for help. And we did that, and in about 7 or 8 days, I signed him off for a certificate. But that was a real learning experience for me, that good instructors are maybe chatty at the start, but then they've got to back out of it and shut the hell up, which, of course, for me was hard then. I guess it's still kind of hard now. Anyway, thanks for the good episode. We'll see you soon.
All right, boom goes the dynamite. What do you think?
I think that's some excellent feedback there from Rob.
Yeah. Now, you and I think both see eye to eye on a great deal of things. I would even say most things in aviation. But as two people with two different personalities, I can tell you that you, like when you and I fly, and since I've actually been on the receiving end of your flight instruction, I can say this, you, I don't think talk too much, but since you and I are friends, we're like kind of talking all the time, but it's not the over talking sort of CFI way. We're both going to go our separate ways after the flight. But I know that even if that wasn't our relationship, that you, I think, have a very direct way of saying things that is, I guess I should say they're enough and not too much, but not in that, some people are really reserved, and you don't want to be that reserved because you want to be talking most of the time. But at the same time, you don't want to be talking over somebody. You want to be telling them the thing that they need to be figuring out. And I think that you're very good at that. But this spoke to me because, the fact that I'm standing here with in a studio with a microphone in front of my face and I do this podcast, I have a hard time shutting up. And I think I had a very similar experience to Rob with my first student. And I remember we had discussed that last time. And I said I was standing there under the tower watching her solo, and she did a good job. But what I did not add to that was that we had actually stayed into the Christmas break just a little bit. Where I was, it was pretty long. It was almost a month. But we had stayed just a little bit longer in, just to make sure. Oh, I'm sorry. It was the second semester, so it was into the Maymester. We stayed a little bit longer just to finish up. It was like 3 days or something. But in the same way, sort of, she had plateaued, and I couldn't quite figure out why. I sent her on a stage check. Basically, she was good. And nobody ever said, hey, you talk too much. And I don't know that I did, but looking back on it now when Rob was talking, I thought, you know what, maybe that was at least part of it. And again, she did great. She passed. It was fine. But I know some of us have a real big problem not rambling on. Did you have that problem? I'm guessing you didn't.
Well, the way I see some of these things is you have to remember what the content and importance of what you're saying is. I think personally, sometimes people forget that they sat in the same shoes as the student is sitting when they're teaching. Remember, folks, we all sat in that left seat and had to learn, and someone had to sit in the right seat with us while we did it. As we grow from a green pilot into more of a seasoned pilot, sometimes I believe we forget where we came from, and we want people to fly like us. People can do a chandelle or people can do a steep turn, but they may do it and they may need a little more instruction. B, you may need to approach them differently. C, they may just need you to sit back and relax. And I think part of that in the first episode is just being able to adjust your teaching style to someone's learning style and not teaching everyone the same way. So there's a big, and I'm going to say it, gray area there when it comes to teaching each person as an individual versus checking boxes.
Yeah, definitely. How do you figure out if a person needs you to talk more or needs you to talk less?
Well, again, I don't necessarily think that the talking is it. I think it's the content of what's coming out. So you can talk to someone, which I like to do throughout the maneuver. It's a method to my madness, because if you can talk and fly, guess what? You can not talk and fly really well. So the old adage is nothing ever works right when the instructor's in the airplane. When the instructor gets out of the airplane, everything's perfect.
Right.
So that's kind of the approach there. So like this gentleman said, he gets out of the airplane, goes fly. He gets out of the airplane, the student goes flies with somebody else. Well, so-and-so flies great. Well, sure, they fly fine. But you got to remember, they probably always flew fine.
Yeah, interesting. But yeah, there's a lot of judgment that has to be sort of put into that, because I think for some people, they don't give you that same amount of feedback. Like if somebody's not a natural communicator, I know that a lot of people, and I've worked with a few of these, that they feel that giving you really almost any amount of feedback is going to be considered confrontational. And I don't just mean confrontational as in, I've given you some information, but more of like I'm actually confronting you like I'm mad. And they may or may not be the kind of person that is good at taking constructive criticism or even just training in general. But I think that it's hard sometimes to tell when somebody needs a little helping hand or when sort of letting them figure it out is the right thing to do. I remember back for me, when I became a check airman at the flight school, I sat down with the owner / chief pilot, and my training mainly consisted of, look, man, your new job is to evaluate, not to instruct. And every point during that training kept circling back to that, because we all want to keep having our CFI hat on, but this is somebody else's student who needs a fair and unbiased evaluation of their skills because they're about to be signed off for some new privilege, right? So I remember having to sit there and how hard I had to bite my own tongue sometimes when the person wasn't doing so great. And I remember the first person I ever was like, hey man, we need to do this again. You need to go back to your CFI. I let it go real far until we just about busted a restricted area. Did not, for the record. But, I let it go to within about 3/4 of a mile before I was like, okay, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take the controls now. Made a nice steep turn. And he was like, why are you doing that? I said, well, let's take a look at this chart right now. And he eventually lost the color in his face and said, "Oh my God, I almost flew into a restrict area, didn't I?" I said, "Yeah." So it was really hard for me to sit there and watch the guy do that and pretend that I'm more of a DPE than a CFI. But at the same time, it broke me of that constantly instructing thing and being able to just evaluate and then, you know, I hate leaving people hanging. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And we all don't like uncomfortable lulls in conversation. We all don't like to watch someone flounder. But I guess at some point you kind of have to just let them struggle and figure it out. And, you know, now I feel like that as a parent sometimes too, is I have to be very judicious with how much help I'm going to give. Because, of course, the last person in the world I'd like to see struggle with anything is my own child. But then again, we need to struggle a little bit in order to learn and become better, because that's how we become stronger and more intelligent and more clever. But it's a definite gray area, and probably a thin line in a gray area, I'd say.
Sure. One of the things you made me think about during that explanation there, Brandon, which is outstanding, is that something I do with people that I teach is, and we'll take steep turns for example, because that's a pretty easy one to just give on the show here. But what I will do is say, hey, we're going to start at, 4,500 feet. We're going to start on a heading of north. We'll bug that. And our plus or minus factor is X, depending on if we're working on a private, working on a commercial, or we're up just doing some ATP practice or something like that. So our obviously our standards are going to change. So let's just say it's plus or minus 100 feet. Just let them do it. And when they're done with the maneuver, have them rate themselves. Would you pass that maneuver? Just sit there. I don't care if they go up 200 feet, go down 200 feet, go up and down 50 feet. It doesn't matter. Let them do it and then have them self-evaluate. A lot of times, if that takes place, what you get is, okay, now, sir or ma'am, CFI, please help me out. Okay, this is what I see, blah, blah, blah. This is when a flight instructor needs to be able to demonstrate. Then you've got to demonstrate how to do it properly. And then you've got to teach them how to do what you just did. But allowing them to do it and evaluate themselves, I have found, is also a very good technique when it comes to maneuvers and maneuver completion to a certain standard for a specific rating.
Yeah, I think that when somebody's given the opportunity to evaluate their own performance in really any facet of life, I've almost found people get real honest, like almost kind of weirdly. It puts them in a different mindset. Like, for instance, it's almost like that book, Soft Selling in a Hard World. If you just hit someone right in the front with all the sales tactics, they're just wearing armor in the front, and they're ready to say no. But if you come around the back way and don't approach things as like a blunt object, you get a lot better results. And I think this sort of maybe is analogous to that, just in the fact that when you ask somebody to evaluate their own performance, they're not being evaluated, where now they're suddenly sitting there in a position of, okay, great, here it comes. This guy's going to tell me I suck, and here's why. But they can say, okay, you know what? Fair is fair. Let me tell you how I think I did. And it may or may not be completely accurate, but they're definitely coming from a different headspace. And I think that that's really good, because it helps them form those opinions in their head, because now they're working through it, almost like talking to a psychologist or something. That person can't just fix you, but they are going to help work you through the thing in your mind that you need to get through. And as a CFI, I mean, I do feel like an armchair psychologist sometimes. And, I have zero qualification other than the FOI, insert joke here about that. But, I do think that stuff is fascinating. And I think anytime you can give somebody the opportunity to say it themselves in their own words, as opposed to just sit there and have to receive it, they're going to be in a completely different place.
Absolutely. One of the things that I like to do before, let's say, a flight lesson of such, I don't care what kind of flight lesson it is. It could be private instrument, commercial, whatever. You're going up, or it could be you're given an IPC or this and that, but really an IPC is demonstrated. It's not taught. But if you need to go fly, a day or two before you give an IPC with somebody, that's what I'm talking about. But I like to set the standard on the ground and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. There's no surprises. X, Y, Z, blah, 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 blah. We need to have a do and verify flow when we start the airplane. We need to have a good instrument taxi check. We've got to, verbalize X, Y, and XYZ, PDQ, blah, 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 all up and down the list. So I set the standard on the ground, generally speaking. And when we go up in the air, one of the things I'll do is I'll step back sometimes and say, okay, put the autopilot on in heading mode, maintain current altitude and, current heading. Okay, do you remember what we talked about on the ground? Yes. Okay, did you demonstrate that just now? No. What happened? Okay, it gives them a chance to think and evaluate there. Or that could be a different scenario of, okay, heading altitude autopilot now. You did an excellent job of that. That was great, and that's exactly what we talked about on the ground. So either or, you're going to get a result, and we're going to revert back to something that we discussed prior of what that standard was for today's lesson.
As you're talking, I'm thinking in that situation, you're talking about more or less sort of like an IPC is kind of what I had in my head. And I've got this vision of you, and it's probably a more higher performance airplane. Maybe, we're talking about like a Skylane or something like that, or, 400, Cessna 400 or Columbia or whatever you want to call it. But let's talk about, since you're one of those people who sort of gets to be in the more rarefied air of not really teaching primary anymore, not really teaching, well, funny enough, you are teaching a lot of single engine, but it's all single engine turboprop. And, as you've taught me into that world, and at some point I will hopefully be turning around and teaching in that world as well, there's just so much of a difference in what you're doing versus sort of these situations that we talk about for CFI training. We talk about doing these Chandelles and Lazy Eights and the ACS and back in there the PTS, and we talk about the fundamentals of instructing, and we talk about the regs and all that. But once somebody buys themselves a TBM, and now it's your job to get them safe and insurable in that thing, kind of talk us just through the differences and what that's like, the headspace you're in versus what you were like, before. And maybe even if you could share like some good stories and examples about things that you've run into that no CFI back in a 172 will have seen.
Well, the funny thing is that I find it almost the opposite in a sense of when someone does get a TBM, and we're considering this to be owner flown here. So someone had a 172 or learned in one, they bought a Cirrus and then they bought a TBM. They just kind of moved up there.
They started with a Cirrus, man. That's where it started.
Yeah, right. So generally, a good point, right? So they bought a Cirrus, they learned in that, and then they bought a TBM. The good thing about hopping in one of those things is the person you hop in the airplane with is already rated. So you've got a TBM. I've never gotten in a TBM with somebody that didn't have a private pilot's license with an instrument rating. So they've got 2 ratings, and we're supposed to be able to demonstrate the standard of those 2 ratings. That's a plus, because now we're not teaching somebody how to fly an airplane. We're teaching someone how to fly that airplane. The good thing is the thing works like the other airplane works. It's got pedals. It's got a yoke. You pull back, it goes up. You push forward, it goes down, right? You hit the right pedal, it wants to yaw right. You hit the left pedal, it wants to yaw left. So the fundamentals of the aircraft are the same. You just have to learn the airplane, the systems, the limitations. One of the big ones is starting it and shutting it down. But then when people get in a turboprop, they realize, this is a whole lot easier starting it up and shutting it down than it is a piston. Then we get into the game of now we got to manage an airplane versus fly it sometimes, because now we put the autopilot on and we do X, Y, and Z. So I found it almost easier to get into those airplanes and teach than to have someone from ground zero and go through a private pilot's course in say a 172. To me, that's much more challenging.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, anybody that I fly with that's already well experienced, I guess we'll say, it's not the same at all. I mean, they've already had all those impressions put on them. They've already had all these hundreds or even thousands of hours of experience behind them. But sometimes, just because you've flown a Cirrus for 500 hours doesn't mean now that you're ready for a TBM. I mean, some people are and some people aren't. It just depends on who you get. But there's definitely a change in attitude that comes with it, because flying turboprops is, in a way, like you said, simpler. For instance, engine starting, there's not a whole lot to it, but there's a whole lot more that can go wrong with it. But at the same time, now you're dealing with a completely different, I mean, I guess to me it just comes down to psychology again. You're not so much worrying about the physical skills. I mean, you are. They have to learn how to, some simple flows and where your hands go, and, the muscle memories to, TBM doesn't fly the same as a Meridian, doesn't fly the same as a Cirrus with a side stick, so on. But I think the being in the right headspace about being in the flight levels, single pilot and single engine, the headspace of going that fast, the headspace of managing some systems that are easier and more automated, and then other systems that are, far more complicated, and what happens when the automation goes wrong, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think it's just it's a major change in your attitude as a pilot and as a person than it is sort of just knowledge and skills, because you're still in the same regs, you're still in the same certification standards, you're still in the same airspace. The machine that you're flying is so capable, but at the same time, it's kind of like playing with knives. I mean, if you know what you're doing, it's cool, but if you mess up the wrong way, it can cut you. But I think you're more into the realms of psychology at that point. Would you agree?
Sure, no, I would agree definitely. Also, that I would agree that some of the things that you're liable to liable to get you into a pickle is a different kind of pickle too. When you get into the turboprop situation, or when you go up from let's say a 172 to a Cirrus to a TBM-ish type situation, the things that you're going to be faced with that can get you violated, things like speed limits. Like you said, flying in Class A airspace, being ahead of the airplane, teaching someone how to think that far ahead of the airplane. You just have to sit there with them long enough and let them do it. You can't really teach someone to think ahead of the airplane. You've got to tell them, hey, eventually, as we get experienced enough, as we fly this airplane, you're going to be able to think 2 minutes ahead of the airplane, 5 minutes ahead of the airplane. Where in the 172, you just had to think a minute to 30 seconds ahead of the airplane, because it doesn't go that fast. So now that you're going faster, you're going to have to think further ahead of the aircraft. But at the same time, you need the knowledge to know what it needs to be doing at what point. If you don't have that knowledge, you can't think ahead of the airplane. So it's a matter of just sitting next to someone long enough that they learn how to do that. And the only way to learn how to do it is to let them do it. And that's where it becomes, hey, how far can you let someone go before you have to say, hey, or my airplane, or, this and that. We've got things like redline. Some of these airplanes blow right through redline. You never see redline in a 172, right? Well, shoot, in a TBM or in a Meridian especially, you can blow right through redline easily. A lot of airplanes you can do it. So when it becomes to flying the airplane or managing the airplane, I think from a management standpoint, it becomes a lot more complicated. From a flying standpoint, it's the same pedals and yoke you've always seen.
Yeah, I mean, the Meridian to me feels just like a Saratoga, to be perfectly honest. But there's a whole lot more you got to do. I think what you said really circles us back to our original point, though, here, and Rob's feedback and all that, is you need to sit there and let them do it.
Exactly. I mean, you have to sit there, let them do it, and they're going to do fine 99 times out of 100. You teach them right, you give them guidance, this and that, they want to do it. This thing's fun. I tell everybody I fly with, we're going to make each other better pilots, but you got to remember this is too cool to not have fun. So the number one thing we're going to do is we're going to have a good time.
I think one thing that might sort of tie these dissimilar things together, like or maybe I should say conflicting points of view, like we're sitting here saying we need to talk a lot because we're instructors and we need to We need to instruct. Frankly, that's your job. But then on the other hand, you also need to not talk sometimes and let them do it. You know, where do you find that? And one thing, and you touched on this right at the end, which is what reminded me, is you say give them guidance. So I think the guidance that you give sometimes is some of the, that's really where the magic happens. For instance, I fly on weekends with a gentleman who basically all we do is psychology. He can fly an airplane fine. He's not gonna wreck an airplane, but you know, he came from the Northeast where there were, I think, 3 towered airports in the state he was living in, and so he didn't want to talk to ATC, and he came out here and had one of the local guys from the big TRACON kind of give one of those power presentations, and it scared him even more. And you know, he hired me to help him get better at it, and we became friends and so on. But we went from, you know, this guy doesn't even want to talk to the tower to he can fly in and out of John Wayne, Santa Ana Class Charlie Airport, parallel in 757s by himself, and he thinks that's easy. And his whole mindset has changed. He would prefer to fly into airports like that now because it's so procedural and so much more generally organized than, you know, cowboy country, for lack of a better word. And it's just amazing how that changed because he now had the tools to deal with that. But one little nugget I gave him, and I'm going to give this to everyone else, and it's actually not mine. I was taught this by a great CFI who was teaching me in my private way back in the day. But some of those little mnemonics that you can have are little ways or sayings that you can say to memorize what you need to do. For instance, this guy told me the 5 A's, and I still use this, and I pass this on to students of mine. So when you're sort of getting in range of that airport, right, you're starting to think about that top of descent, you know, you planned it out, whether it's the rule of 3 or the descent rate times your speed and distance thing, or however you figured it out. I'm not going to open up that can of worms right now, but you're coming up on your top of descent, or even just when you feel like the controller is going to give it to you for up high. I do what's called, or I teach my students at least to do the 5 A's, which is first you got to pick up that ATIS. Then after that, you're going to set those altimeters. Then give that alignment one last check. So if you have a heading indicator, not a, you know, nice fancy HSI or flux valve or something like that, but something that's going to need to be reset, give that a last check. Avionics setup. And then I've got a special little way I teach them to set that up for the comms, and a special little recipe I give them for how to set that up for the navs. So there's basically been given a recipe that goes off this 5 A's mnemonic for each item so that you can have now a framework in your head for how to do it. And the last thing is approach briefing. And whether you're IFR or IFR, that's a little more self-explanatory. Now there's many ways to brief an approach as there are companies and pilots out there. So again, I'm not going to step into that one, but you know, even if you're VFR, you're still going to have to plan, hey, how am I going to enter this traffic pattern? Or, hey, this controller is probably going to tell me to do this, or so on, you know. And then when I land, where am I going to try to exit the runway? Where's our FBO going to be? And all that fun stuff. So you just sort of thought this all through. So like you said, thinking 30 seconds, a minute, 10 minutes, 15 minutes ahead of the airplane. So you've kind of got a framework going. So through those 5 A's, the ATIS, altimeter, alignment, avionics, and approach briefing, you're probably not going to miss a whole lot. And then there's a checklist for everything else. When you start descending, guess what? There's a descent checklist. Before you land, there's a before landing checklist. And of course, we're going to accomplish those as well. But you've given that person the tools then so that now they can at least go through that by themselves, so they're not just floundering like, I don't know what I'm doing. They have a framework for it. And then as a CFI, you just are sort of nudging them into that, like, hey, what's that next day? Oh, right. And then they work through that. So you're not going to sit there and talk all over them. You just give them a little nudge, and then they can work through it themselves. And for me, I found that to be, I think, a nice happy medium for not talking too much or too little, and still giving them that opportunity to really get there and have those realizations themselves that are going to make them successful.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. We all need or have something we use, the 5 A's. I like that. Any of our organizational techniques, like you said, you know, there's 100 ways to do this and there's 100 ways to do that. But the bottom line is organization. And I think one other thing is experience and how many times have you done it? So if you had the practice medium to say, okay, we're going to go from San Diego to Camarillo every day, so Lindbergh up to CMA and back. So we're going to do that twice a day. So we're going up CMA and back up CMA and back. If you did that twice a day, and you just did that, and you did that for, I don't know, 2 straight weeks, you'd be pretty proficient after that, comparatively to if you were someone that was flying, not in that busy environment, and you came out to California, and then that's what you did. You could say the same thing if you just went, say, Dallas to Houston. So if you went Dallas Love down to Houston Intercontinental, and you just said, okay, I've got my own airplane. This is how I'm going to work on my proficiency and get a CFI or a safety pilot, somebody to sit next to me that has a more time experience or can watch me do this, and then sit there and do that and do it over and over. Then the next time, let's say, okay, now that we've got Houston down, let's go to San Antonio. It's going to be the same thing. You're just going to go to SAT instead of IAH, per se, and the result's going to be exactly the same. So there is no substitute for repetition and time in the seat. That's, if I can say anything in the A to B flying aspect of the situation. So if you're sitting next to someone that's trying to do that, and you've got to allow them to, do the A to B thing, and that's a big deal. It's one thing to work their radios while they do it all, but it's one thing to turn over everything to them and see them do it.
Can we nerd out for a second since this is a CFI discussion?
Sure, let's do it.
That's the law of exercise, Chad.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I had to do it.
I'm all over it.
I'm done. I'll never do that again, I promise. Anyway.
I'm all about nerding out. There's nothing wrong with nerding out. So I got a great story. So I got a Citation 10 initial, and I'm gonna call this guy out because he's a friend. He's a buddy of mine. His name's John DeLuca. He was my sim partner in 10 initial. So when I get my Citation 10 dive rating, we go into 10 school on day one, and this guy comes in hot, man. This instructor, he comes in and just starts talking about DU1 and reversionary mode and all this stuff. Basically introduces himself, doesn't do any of the typical stuff, and then just he busts right into the deal. And everybody's looking at each other like, man, who is this guy? Well, the funny thing is, we get done with the first half a day of class. Well, we change instructors, right? So we get Suzanne for the second half of day one, and then like the next 3 days. And we're sitting there, and, Suzanne, she's great. And she's got a great personality, unlike the first half of the day. And she starts saying, okay, what's your name? Where are you from? All that good stuff. Tell us a little bit about yourself, blah, blah, blah. Well, John DeLuca sits there, and they make this Star Wars connection, and somebody says, well, have you seen blah, blah, and this and that? And he goes, oh my God, I got to nerd out. Have you seen anything more adorable than Baby Yoda? Baby Yoda is like the most adorable thing. He nerds out on Star Wars. And it was the most fantastic thing for day one, a Citation 10 initial you would ever imagine. I know that sounds crazy, but anyways, nerding out and then going to Star Wars. I know that has nothing to do with today's episode, but that was just awesome. And it totally broke the ice. Anyways, the three of us, we had a great time in class and blah, 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 but we'll never forget the Baby Yoda thing.
Maybe that's a good point to end on here is, if nothing else, have a good personality,
Definitely. Now, if you don't have a good personality, let me tell you, you end up teaching in a simulator because nobody else wants you to fly their corporate aircraft.
There it is. Straight up. I feel like some people just miss that lesson, and that's a bummer.
And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great sim instructors out there. Believe me. I mean, there's tons of them. But you get the premise and you get the idea of what I'm saying.
No, of course. I mean, that the way that you are around anybody you're working with, whether they're paying you, you're paying them, or somebody else is paying the both of you to be there. I mean, nobody wants to be around. We know you have the knowledge. We know you're there. You have the knowledge. But yeah, I mean, having a great personality makes just such a difference in terms of the enjoyability of any experience, whether you're sitting in a classroom or flying a Citation 10 or anything else for that matter. Yeah, I think that might be the most important thing of all, is if you're talking, I don't know, at least you could smile, I guess, right?
Oh, exactly. And hey, if you're let's have a good time. When you're out there teaching and you're out there flying and you're out there doing whatever, this is too cool to not have fun. And if some people don't, but or don't approach it that way, but I think approaching it as, hey, it's serious fun, but it's fun. This is a great time. Not a whole lot of people in the world ever get to do it, and it's pretty special. So every time I go up, I'm having a good time.
When you trained me in the Meridian, I mean, there was never a moment where I felt like I was in class or trying to figure out, you know, how I'm going to get through this or whatever. I mean, it was always, you gave the San Diego to Camarillo example, because we went up to Camarillo and had a cool lunch at one of the best airport restaurants anywhere, right?
Fabulous.
We went to Monterey, you know, another dump, right? Terrible.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We went to Monterey, and then we went to From Scratch, and we had lunch. It was great.
Absolutely. As seen on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. But you know
yeah,
what?
It's Triple D.
It lived up. And we went to Big Bear. And I learned how to start that thing, to do a hot start in a PT6 at a 7,000-foot density altitude, which was pretty cool. But
the greatest leg ever. We've flown a lot of legs, tons of legs. The greatest leg ever, Brandon, was when we went to from Big Bear to San Bernardino. That was awesome.
That was, I think we climbed, 300 AGL and then had to descend more or less almost through a canyon straight into the pattern.
Yeah, it was fun. That was a blast.
Yeah, you're like, wait, I climbed 300 feet and I descended 5,000. How did that work? Anyway.
That was awesome, though.
But this is it. And that's why there was never a minute of that felt like I'm getting an initial type rating and something. I mean, it never felt like that, because we have such a good time when we fly. I wish that all students and all instructors had that much fun. I really do. Like, if I could just wish something for anybody listening to the show, it's that you're having even a fraction of as much fun as Chad and I are having when we're out there doing our thing. And I think that's really what it's all about at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I know one thing is you got to relax. When you're over there in that right seat, you just got to relax, man. Because when you're relaxed, the person next to you is going to relax. If you're intense, they're going to be intense. And that's another point of, hey, the guy that I fly with, his name is John Beam, and John's awesome. And I have learned so much from John, and I'm going to keep learning from John as long as we're flying together, and I hope it's a long time, because he is an awesome captain, and I'm really lucky to get to fly co-captain with him. But he has a saying, and it's, hey, man, you're holding on too tight. You know, not literally, but you know what I mean. You're holding on too tight. So, you know, you can't, just relax. And I always tell people this too. When I have passengers, if I have any passengers that are nervous, I tell them, hey, you know what? You don't panic unless you see me panic. If I'm panicking, it's time to panic, believe me. But if I'm not panicking, you just sit back there and relax.
So, what do you think? You ready? You want to be in Dallas and buy Chad a beer? I don't know. Now, whatever's on your mind, send me your thoughts. Brandon, podcastingonaplane.com. You can use your smartphone or the SpeakPipe widget that pops up anytime you visit podcastingonaplane.com to record us something, and I or we can't wait to hear what's on your mind. And while you're on the website, maybe consider supporting the show financially too. If you have the means and you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. And if you're not into that recurring thing, there's always a PayPal link there too for whatever you feels right. As always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes, and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. That's all for now. Your frequency change approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.
Nobody ever gets hosed in aviation.